Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Psalm 139. Psalm 139. And beginning in verse 7, it says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I lift up the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me." There is in this psalm and in so many other places an overwhelming sense of the presence of God, that He is everywhere that we could be or think of being, that He is ever present. Yesterday, when I got a text from Marshall updating me on his current status, I was eating breakfast with a brother and friend, and we were talking about Homer's Odyssey and some observations from reading that book. And that combined with, I told him as we were leaving, I said, if you have any ideas for a sermon, you just text me and let me know. But he'd already given me some ideas. And that combined with a podcast from Larson Plyler, which I'll just put in a plug for. He has a podcast called Back to the Bible. And it's very worth your time, 30-minute episodes. I was listening to that this week and came upon an episode that he devoted to the concept of godliness. And those thoughts put together formed the sermon that we'll look at today on this idea of the presence of God, and that specifically connected to godliness. Now, I don't bring up Larson and this other brother to blame them for this sermon, but for any goodness that comes out, to give them some credit. Well, the idea of being in God's presence or recognizing God's presence is, I think, such a fundamental character of God's people, or needs to be a fundamental, that it needs to be something that we particularly aim at. And in fact, a primary aspect of our relationship to Him is just an awareness and a recognition of His presence. And along that vein, along those lines, the idea of godliness is where I want to begin that this morning. When you look at the word godliness, it is very easy to take away that godliness must mean God-likeness, right? To be like God. And in fact, you can find several little devotionals on the word godliness that will make that very point. It's the idea of being like God. I want to suggest to you that the result of godliness is God-likeness. And we certainly do want to be like God, but that's not the definition of the word. The idea is reverent devotion. In fact, in some of the places where this word godliness turns up, which it doesn't turn up very often, incidentally, only a handful of times in the New Testament. I think Paul uses it 13 times. It's once in the book of Acts, a few times in 1 Peter. But it's not a constant word that we find. But on the few occasions that it does show up, sometimes it's translated piety, which we've talked about before. That this idea of piety was a very thoroughly saturated concept in first century culture, in the pagan culture, in Roman culture. That is devotion to God and devotion to family. One dictionary put it this way: in pagan literature, godliness meant showing proper caution, fear, or reverence towards the gods. Such piety involved the offering of sacrifices and other cult activities. It also meant honoring the gods by respecting elders, masters, rulers, and all the orders of life thought to be under the protection of the gods. So not only did you make a constant devotion to God, but a constant devotion to everything that the gods said and talked about and claimed protection over. And if you disrespected those aspects of life in any way, you were sort of inviting chaos into your life. And very often, the chaos that came prompted especially pagans, to look around and say, who have I offended? Now, there's a very positive aspect of that, and then I'll talk about the negative. The positive is they felt everything was connected to the gods. We talked about in class this morning. They had a God for everything, right? So if storms hit when they were in the seas, what did I do to make Poseidon mad? Right? If they failed in battle, why was Athena not on my side? Right? Whatever it is, whatever was happening, crops fell, rain coming, rain not coming, they were looking to the gods and saying, why are they on or not on my side? But there was a constant sense of God is right there. The gods are right there. Now, the negative side of that certainly is that they had no idea what the gods were thinking. Right? And Larson talked about that in one of his lessons, sort of this desperation of I just wish I knew what the gods wanted from me. We don't have that problem. But while we do not have a God for everything, we have a God who is over everything. He is over the storms. He is over every battle. And he is over when the rain comes and when it doesn't come. And when the sun shines and when it doesn't shine. He is over all of it. And so we don't have it. We don't have this sense of a fractured sense of deity, but we ought to have the same sense that deity is over everything. It's just that we have a unified picture of who that deity is. And so that gives you a sense of when Paul comes into Athens in Acts chapter 7, and he says, I perceive that you are very religious. In other words, there's something about they have the right idea that there are gods over everything. And what Paul wants to say is, no, but you're not entirely wrong. There is a God over everything. And the characteristics that you assign to Zeus and Athena and Poseidon and all of these other gods, they are the characteristics of one God, at least in his power and protection and judgment and his concern about every single thing that you do. That was not wrong. That was not the problem that they had. It is then godliness. Some people describe it as God-towardness. It is a mindset that leans in the direction and thinks constantly on God. Larson brought up in his podcast, he started in Genesis chapter 17, and you see this language that God uses with Abraham throughout, especially the Old Testament. But in Genesis chapter 17, as God is calling Abram, he says, in the first instance, it says it happened when Abram was 99 years old. Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. That idea of walk before me. Now, in one sense, we are always walking before him. Right? No matter what you're doing, you're in the presence of God. And so it's not a matter of you're sort of calling something into being. It's more of you're aware of something that is real. You are in God's presence. But what God is calling Abraham to do is walk, is not walk in his presence because, he was walking outside of his presence, now he's walking in his presence, but walk with an awareness of the presence of God, right? Walk in God's presence from the standpoint of I realize I'm walking with God is right there. He's paying attention. He knows and sees everything that I do. Godliness is taking every step with an awareness that God sees it. It is living before God with a life that is God-focused, God-centered, God-conscious. Our life should revolve around God. Joshua chapter 1 and verses 8 and 9 as Joshua is taking up that leadership role. And we've studied this in our Bible class, looked at it in a sermon at the beginning of the year. This phrase, this command here in Joshua 1 and verse 8, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way successful, and then you will be prosperous. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be in dread or dismayed, for Yahweh your God is with you wherever you go. I think there are two aspects of that. First of all, he talks about here's what you need to be thinking about all the time. And it's my words. Every day, every night, all the time, be thinking about this so that you can live your life this way. And if you do that, then I'm going to be right there by your side and on your side the whole time. And Joshua goes forward with the confidence and the courage and the strength because he knows that God, and a little bit later, that the commander of the Lord's army is right by his side as he goes into battle. I know that we are not privileged to have the kind of vision that Joshua had in being able to see, tangibly see, visualize the presence of God. But as Peter tells us, as he is relaying his own experience at the Mount of Transfiguration, and he's saying that he got to see that, he says, but you have the prophets. We do have all that we need to be able to abide in that thoughtfulness of God's presence. But we need to spread it all the way out into every part of our life. That notion that nothing escapes his attention. As we already read in Psalm 39, that there's nowhere that we can go. Picking up in verse 11, if I say, surely the darkness will bruise me and the light will be my night, even the darkness is not too dark for you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. There is no place that you can go from the attention of God. In Proverbs 15 and in verse 3, it says, the eyes of Yahweh are in every place, watching the evil and the good. Hebrews chapter 4 and in verse 13, there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are uncovered and laid bare to the eyes of him to whom we have an account to give. I understand the misguidedness of pagan culture. But they constantly were evaluating, at least in the literature. I don't know about everyday people, but in the literature, which presents an ideal, there's a picture of people who are constantly examining their behavior in terms of what do the gods think about this? What do the gods think about what I'm doing in this moment? Does it please them? Does it displease them? What can I do to reconcile when I have displeased them? And always thinking in those terms. Well, instead of just sort of shaking our heads and really in a modernistic way shaking our heads at those primitive people, the notion that God is always paying attention, that's not a primitive notion. The problem is not that they just haven't learned so much as we have. The problem is, in fact, they had forgotten that there was one God, but that they were cognizant of the presence of deity is a thing that we need more of. I was listening to a commercial about dog food, of all things, and they were going through talking about the science that had gone into developing this particular dog food for your beloved pet, and described all the qualities and says, does that sound good? Science did that. That was the end of the commercial, right? Science did that. It's the clarion call of our culture, isn't it? Look around. Look at all that science has provided for us. Never mind the things that science did over there. Don't look over there behind that curtain. We need that kind of acknowledgement. God did that. God did that. Always thinking and saying, God did that. We do that when we're children. We frequently have that sort of awareness. We were driving down the road about a year ago, and Ryla just started talking about all the things that God is bigger than. I don't know what prompted that, what brought that thought into his mind. I'm sure it was in a Bible class or something. He said, God is bigger than our car. Yes, he is. God is bigger than that building over there. Yeah, he's bigger than that. God is bigger than the whole sky. Yeah, he is. And then he said, and God is even bigger than Emma. I mean, it was true. Like, I don't know what all his thought process was, but I know that thought process of God in relation to the world that he was passing by going down the road was there. And too often we drive past the whole world and do not give a thought to God. But we are thinking about what man has accomplished, what I've accomplished, but not what God is and ever always is accomplishing. And so I want to spend our time then thinking a little bit about training and godliness. How do we train our minds to be godly? First of all, just note over in 1 Timothy chapter 4. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, this is something that Paul highlights with regards to the word godliness. He says in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 7, refuse godless myths fit only for old women. On the other hand, train yourself for the purpose of godliness. For bodily training, he says, is only of little profit, but godliness is profitable for all things, since it holds the promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Train yourself for the purpose of godliness. There is a sense in which you do have to train the mind to have that constant sense of God's presence, to have a constant awareness of God's presence. Because, first of all, he's not standing right here in our visible awareness. So, it takes some work. Now, I do want to give a caveat to that. Over in Romans chapter 1, as it begins in verse 18, it says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And he goes on to talk about the invisible attributes of God, which are evident, which are clear. And so, in order to ignore God, at some level, it takes active suppression, right? You can't help but acknowledge God's presence if you're being honest. And so the issue is really, I think what Paul is talking about training is to enhance something that is and should naturally already be there. I would make a similar point to what we see in Romans chapter 1. Again, one of the things that he says people, as they suppress these things, one of the consequences is that they lose natural affection. And so the affection, especially like affection towards our children and so forth, that this is something that like you should be able to appeal to that as something that just is existent, right? You don't have to you don't have to go into a delivery room and say, now you need to love your child that you just brought into this world. You know, we already feel that, right? It's something that is compelling, and it takes an active suppression, actually, for women to ignore that natural affection, even for men to ignore that natural affection. And yet, Paul also tells older women to train the younger women to love their children, right? So there's a part that's natural, and then a part that has to be trained on from that natural foundation. So I think that there is a natural foundation for the acknowledgement of God being there, but we have to build on that. We have to expand it out and make sure that it is more constant. To illustrate this point, over in Numbers chapter 20, Numbers chapter 20 is where Moses and Aaron failed to heed and to acknowledge God in the striking of the rock on this occasion, bringing forth water from the rock. And in God's judgment on that occasion, it says in verse 12, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. That is such strong language to someone, especially in Moses, who certainly would not have lacked an awareness of God's presence. Moses had been in God's presence in a way that you and I never will until this life is over. And yet on this occasion, somebody whose face had glowed with the presence of God could, in a fit of frustration and anger, forget God was there. And for that moment of forgetfulness, he would not receive the reward that he had longed his whole life to receive. And so it is, I think, with many of us. It's not that we go around with total disregard of God's presence, but it is that we set him to the side all too often. And maybe we say, well, obviously I still come to church every week and multiple times a week, and I do my Bible lesson, I do my daily Bible reading. I tell you, Moses had experienced God far more intensely than any of that and still forgot it. And so can you, time and again, as we go into sin in so many different ways, sin in private, sin among our relationships, in the way that we talk, in the way that we think, all of these things where we just set God to the side. So we need to train our minds to be more rigorous in our awareness of God's presence. First of all, let me just say then that what this is going to involve is daily meditation on God's word. Meditation on God's word. That's what Joshua is commanded in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 8 that we read a moment ago. Meditate on my word day and night. That does not mean get your daily Bible reading in, but it does include that. That's not enough. I appreciate the determination to say, I'm going to get through the Bible in a year. Tom Holly, I was at a preacher study last week, and they were talking about how to get people involved in various Bible reading plans. And people were just, talking about all the different ways to try. And a lot of it was like, how do we lower the bar enough so that people could at least do this, right? Read one chapter of Proverbs a day. Just read one psalm a day. Just read half a chapter a day, right? Just 5 verses. And I said, well, what Tom Holly does is says, if you break the day up into minutes, 1% of the day is a little over 14 minutes. And in that amount of time, you can read the Bible through entirely in a year and then go back and read the New Testament again. That's how much time it would take to read the whole Bible in a year. Does God deserve 1% of your day? So I said, y'all are aiming too low. You need to take a page out of Tom's book. And we don't even get that done so often. But then if we do, what if we do give him 14 minutes and 23 seconds of our day and we read through the whole Bible in a year? We haven't even come close to what God is asking of Joshua. That is not to be able to have that little check mark on the Bible app for the day that says you did your daily Bible reading. Wonderful. Did you give it any thought after that? Chew on it. Process it. Meditate on it. Every day, every night. So often when we come and we hear sermons that challenge us, sermons that somebody says, I'm not sure I quite grabbed hold of everything that he was saying. Good. Now you've got something to chew on and process. If you got it all while you were sitting right here so that you can forget it as soon as you walk out that door, what good was it? You've got to spread that across the day, across the week, into your whole life. You cannot fill your mind with godlessness and then hope to overwhelm the godlessness throughout the week with a couple of sittings of godliness and a few moments of the day. You can't hope to 3 times a week give an hour or 2 of attention to his word and hope that will overwhelm the rest of everything you've been thinking about that has nothing to do with God throughout the week. But now, let me take that one step further. I think the problem is that too much of our lives do have nothing to do with God, when it ought to be everything ought to have something to do with God. In Titus chapter 2, in verse 11, it says, the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, instructing us that denying ungodliness and worldly desires, we should live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age. I think one of the things that helps get this idea of what is godliness is to contrast it with godlessness. When we say somebody's godless, usually what we mean is they're immoral. That's the result of godlessness. But what we mean is they don't acknowledge God. They don't acknowledge his standards. They don't acknowledge his presence and his oversight of their lives. And the result is that they're grossly immoral people. The same thing with godliness, right? That good morals and righteous living is the result of godliness. It's not what godliness is, but it is the result of godliness. That is, when you're thinking about God all the time, guess what? You are going to act like God because you're thinking about him all of the time. And so when God's grace comes into our lives and it gives us the instruction through his word that is grace, that what we do is we put away godlessness and we put on godliness, that mindfulness of him. We use so often Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17, which says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Whatever you do. And then we use that, and we use it most frequently to apply to what happens in this building. Whatever we do in church function, do in his name, do with his authority. Let me just tell you, while it certainly does apply there, this is a personal application. Whatever you're doing every single day, all under his authority, all under his watchful eye. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 16. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing. In everything, give thanks. For this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. A constant thought of what I'm doing and how that is connected to God. I think one of the reasons that it is hard for us to sort of live out 1 Thessalonians 5, 16 through 18 is because we are engaged in so many things that are not immoral, but we just don't know how to thank God for those things because we've made such a separation between our daily lives and God. So I see when people are watching sports, talking about sports, and recently I saw a coach talking about God, and players were talking about God, and they were doing it in ways that weren't the most thoughtless ways. I kind of appreciated. And one particular coach, who I have some particular affection for, he says what we want our players to do is put themselves in the best position to enjoy God's blessings. Right? So he's not saying God's going to give us the victory. It's not, Philippians 4:13. But if you behave yourself rightly, if you do the right things, then you are most likely to have the blessings that come with that. That's proverbial wisdom right there. And then I see people who hate the combination of the talk of sports and religion will say, God doesn't care about basketball. Okay. God doesn't care for the same reasons you care. He doesn't care about it like you care about it. But there is nothing that happens on this planet that God does not care about. Not a single thing that anybody does that God has no care about. That is the whole point. In Matthew 5, he says, there is not a bird that falls out of the sky, but God cares for it and cares about it. It's all his. When we sit down to watch sports or play our games or engage in our hobbies, a lot of times what we're looking for is escape. And it's escape from responsibilities, maybe escape from the pressures of life. You know, people talk about, I got to leave my work at work, and so I can come home and get away from that, from all of the anxiety and so forth. And so when I sit down and I watch a movie, I want to push all of that out. I just want to enjoy this. Let me just say, you cannot push God out of that. Or you can to your own detriment. God has to be a part of that, of your playing basketball or watching it, of your playing games, of when you go fishing, or when you are reading a book, or when you're watching a movie and you say, well, I just want to turn my brain off. You can't turn this part off. When we engage in those sorts of things, if you got a friend with you, I don't know about you, but when I suggest the movie, right? We're going to watch a movie, and I suggest the movie. You ever have that feeling? You're looking over and you're seeing if they're enjoying it as much as you love. This is a beloved movie, so you're looking over and you're like, do you like this movie like I like this movie? And it's frustrating or disappointed if they don't enjoy it like you do. I told Amy one time, we were talking about relationships and so forth. This is early on, and I told her, I said, I broke up with a girl one time because she didn't laugh through The Princess Bride. Not the whole time. It was like, this is not going to work. Because I was looking over, it's like, I'm sorry, if you can't enjoy this, then we're... But I'll tell you something else that happens. You ever pick a movie, and then there's things in it, and because the people in the room, you don't even look over, you just turn red and you cringe because you think, oh no, I didn't know this was in the movie. And now you're embarrassed and you're shamed. And maybe that same shame wouldn't be there if that person wasn't sitting there. I wouldn't feel like this if my parents weren't in the room. I was just going and watching. I would not have that sense of shame and guilt. But God's in the room. And He's watching the movie with you. And do you care what He thinks about it? Are you paying attention to His reaction? You can't see His face. I suggest you can. You can figure out what His face would look like. And you can process that. And that can be a part. Or even after you've watched the movie, you can think of it in terms of what would God take away from this? What would He want me to take away from this? What would He want me to shun from this? In Job 38, God begins His speech to Job in response to all that has happened. And I've talked about this before, and I don't have time to go into it all right now. But one of the things that I think is happening in God's speech is that He is answering so many particulars of points that Job and his friends have brought up. And He's doing that by pointing to creation. And He starts with the very beginnings of creation. Where were you, when I formed the earth? Where were you when I created all these things? When I brought order? Job thinks life is chaos, and God's saying, look, I brought order to chaos. I'm a God of order, not a God of chaos. Job talks about God turning the mountains upside down, and God says, I'm the one that put them right side up. And then He talks about darkness and light, and God says, I'm the one who makes it dark and the one who makes it light for your benefit. And He talks about God not hearing the cries, and He says, I hear when a baby raven cries out. Don't you think I hear you? And Job's friends talk about God breaking the teeth of the lions, and Job talks about being the prey of lions, and God says, the lions are my pets. And I'm the one that feeds them. And what you end up with, as you get to Job's response, and he says, I'd heard of you with the hearing of the ears, but now I see you with the seeing of the eyes. And I do think Job has learned to see God, not just in the whirlwind, but to see Him in life. To see Him like that little child driving down the road who sees God everywhere and constantly says, God made this, and God made this, and God made that. Yes, He did. I remember 26 years ago, hearing a sermon on the radio. I just happened to be fiddling around on the radio, driving down the road on a Sunday afternoon, and heard a sermon, and it just caught a snippet of it. And this man was talking about the monotony of a child. And he said, a child will strain your patience asking you to do something again that you thought was silly and entertaining, but you had not imagined that the child could somehow continue to get entertainment 30 minutes later of performing the same task again and again and again. And no matter how many times you do it, they will say, do it again. He said, every morning the sun comes up, same direction it always has. And every morning we need to develop a sense of the child that says, do that again. Wow. Amazing. Do it again. Do it again and do it again. That is the consciousness that we're trying to develop and the constant thankfulness. Well, this is going to help us, I think, in terms of having that constant acknowledgement of God's presence in our lives. Helps us to avoid sin. As I was talking about, you got God in the room when you're watching a movie. That's gonna change what comes onto the screen. It's gonna change your conversations, the tone of your voice. You know, when you're having those kind of arguments, and then a guest walks in, and then all of a sudden, whoo, you know, we're getting along well now, and that's right. But also developing a sense of comfort at the thought of God's presence. It's not just a sense of God's judgment and oversight, though that is part of it. We want that reverence and that fear, but we want the comfort. Psalm 23, of course, and verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Psalm 46, and in verse 1, he says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth should change, though the mountains shake into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its lofty pride. This is the very opposite of what Job is saying. He said, the whole world is crumbling, and the psalmist said, yes, but God's not. And so I can endure the mountains crumbling. Over in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, he says, make sure that your way of life is free from the love of money, being content with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? The idea here of being anxious over, money in this particular case, but all of the things that come along with that. And then this solution here. I'm gonna just tell you, I have made some dumb financial decisions, and have put myself in the spot of being terribly anxious over money. And there is nothing like having a wife who comes to you and says, we will get through this together. Except God Almighty saying, I'm right here. That's the only thing I can think of that even surpasses that. It's okay. We will get through this. I'm right here beside you. Even when you've put yourself in that spot, to know and to lean on him and know that he is my helper, what can they possibly do to you? Well, we can lose everything, but not him. Okay, I could deal with that. I could deal with foreclosure. I could deal with them taking away our cars. I could deal with all of that because I know that right there. That is not just, oh no, I've got to do good because God's looking over my shoulder. It is, God is right here beside me. I would never want to disappoint him. because what a very present help he is to me. I think this combination here goes to that idea of kids. You know, there's the time when you walk into a room and you can tell the child is caught off guard by your presence. You ever walk into a room and they look up and you see that look on your face and you know, oh, good, this is bad. You can just see it. And then they get real chatty, want to, hey, Mom, how's it going? How are you? And you're like, oh, what did you do? Just tell me, let's get it over with. So there's that fear, right? That I want to be hidden from Mom and Dad, or fear when they walk into the room, fear of their presence. But I'm going to tell you what, that same child can, in the same day, show tremendous relief at the presence of Mom and Dad. They show up and they're just glad that they're there. Brooklyn, she has known what it's like for Mom and Dad to not be there anymore. Her life has been filled with the terror of not knowing who Mom and Dad is next. And so one day when we were saying to her, we were joking with her like we joke with kids, and, where are y'all going? And, am I going? And somebody said, no, we're just going to leave you here. Explosion, like we've never seen. And we realized she does not have the confidence of our presence like a normal kid her age should. And I think we ought to have that sense of desperation for God's presence. That we need it, we crave it, we cannot do without it. It is our life's blood. That's what we're trying to develop in all this. That's what we're trying to train, as Paul says there in 1 Timothy 4. Our culture has increasingly erased open acknowledgement of God. We live in a society that is godless, not just in its immorality, that is obviously the result, but you see godlessness even where there is not the immorality. Have you ever noticed how increasingly there is not only no mention of God, but no mention of religious life in our shows and movies and books that we read? We've been watching Leave It to Beaver. That's back when it was wholesome, right? They don't go to church. They don't pray before their meals. God is not there. Now you say you got a traditional family. Yes, because that was the beginning stages of thinking we could have all of that without God. Without pointing out He's right there in the middle of it to hold it all together. And we've lost all that, and we don't even realize how long ago we lost it. And so, on the other end, perhaps in an effort not to speak thoughtlessly or frivolously, you see athletes. I've talked about athletes talking about God in sports, and they use God's name in frivolous ways and even in irreverent ways, and we don't want to do that. And so perhaps we err on the side of not mentioning Him nearly enough. And not with that constant sense of God is a ever-present part of my life. We want to develop not just a knowledge of His rules, but an abiding knowledge of Him in a way that affects every moment and every decision, every step of our life centered around Him. He sees every step you take. But recognizing that makes all the difference. And so, if you're here this morning, the invitation to you is the same as to Abraham. Walk before me. And if you would come into His presence, that is your acknowledgement of His presence, to be blameless in His sight, then you get all of the comfort of knowing He's right there beside you, instead of the terror of God walking into the room when you least expect it. I want to be relieved at the thought that God is with me. If there's any way that we can help you make that the case in your life this morning, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?